Welcome everybody to today's Hassenfeld Institute seminar. My name is Amy Anthony. I'm the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Hassenfeld Institute. And I'm very pleased today to introduce to you Dr. Phyllis Dennery. Dr. Dennery is the Chair of Pediatrics at the Warren Alpert Medical School. She is Pediatrician in Chief and Medical Director of Hasbro Children's Hospital. She is the Sylvia K. Hassenfeld Professor of Pediatrics at the Alpert Medical School, and she is Professor of Molecular Biology, Cell Biology, and Biochemistry at Brown. She is also a member of the Hassenfeld Institute's Executive Committee. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. We have a very special speaker today and a great talk for the Institute, and I would like to introduce Dr. James Collins. Dr. Collins earns his BS and MD degrees from the University of Michigan and his MPH from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the Professor of Pediatrics at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. He's the Medical Director of the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit and the Associate Director of the Pediatric Residency Program at Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. He has authored numerous research articles and is a frequent lecturer on issues related to racial and ethnic group disparities in adverse birth outcomes. Dr. Collins has received several awards for his research, teaching, and leadership in maternal and infant health, including the March of Dimes Jonas Salk Health Leadership Award, a research honoree, and the Dwayne Alexander Award for Academic Leadership in Perinatal Medicine from the National Institute of Child Health and Development. He is also a member of several advisory groups addressing the social determinants of infant outcome, and he is a member of the Hassenfeld Institute Advisory Council. So today he will talk to us about racial disparities in adverse birth outcomes, zip code eclipses, genetic code. At the end of his presentation, Dr. Patrick Vivey, another member of the Executive Committee and the professor in the School of Public Health, will entertain questions. So, Dr. Collins.
Thank you, Dr. Dennery. Appreciate that fine introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you my perspective on a long-standing and pervasive health disparities that we have in this country with respect to preterm birth. But first, I kind of like to set the stage by just kind of reviewing the epidemiology of infant mortality. As you all know, infant mortality is defined as the number of infant deaths which occur in the first year of life. A high rate signifies unmet health needs. As a country, we rank neither first, 15th, or 20th, but we're down to 27th in the world in overall infant mortality rates, and our position has deteriorated, unfortunately, since 1960. Despite both focusing on the disparity, I'd like to highlight that if whites were a separate country, our rates really wouldn't be that much improved with respect to our relative international ranking among developed countries. This slide highlights this racial disparity we're going to speak about. African Americans have the highest rate of first-year mortality, followed by Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, infants born to non-Latinx whites, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Cuban Americans actually have a very low rate. The vast majority of African American and white infant deaths occur in the first 28 days of life, and by definition, those are neonatal mortality rates. This slide kind of highlights those for African Americans in red, whites in yellow, and we see that since 1950, rates have decreased for both groups. This has been particularly evident since probably the mid-1970s, and this probably reflects the success of neonatal intensive care units, particularly their success taking care of small preterm infants. If unfortunately you have to be born at 28 weeks and weigh 900 grams, there's probably no better place to be born in the world than a major metropolitan area in the United States. But despite having such outstanding birth rate specific mortality rates, overall neonatal mortality remains one of the major scourges of our healthcare system, That's because birth weight is a far more powerful determinant of outcome. No matter how much technology we have, even in 2021, a group of infants who weigh a kilo will never do as well as a group of infants who weigh 3.5 kilos. Low birth weight, by definition, less than 2,500 grams, account for about 8% of births in this country, yet they account for 2/3 of the deaths. Approximately 66% of these infants are preterm at less than 37 weeks. Only about 1.5% of infants are born with a birth weight less than 1,500 grams, and they, by definition, are very low birth weight, yet they account for 50% of the deaths. So from a public health perspective, we really should go after these very low birth weight, particularly low birth weight, particularly the very low birth weight infants, to really have an impact on overall outcome. This slide shows the 7-decade trend in low birth weight rates in this country for African Americans and whites, and we see that it has been stagnant. Other countries have seen a decline. We have not. If we look at very low birth weight rates, for whites, they've been relatively flat. For African Americans, for unclear reasons, they seem to actually be increasing. The age-related patterns of low birth weight differ by race also. We know that teenage pregnancy is bad from a sociological perspective, and that's true no matter which race. But in terms of outcome, looking at low birth weight on the y-axis, maternal age on the x-axis, we see that for whites, low birth weight rates are actually highest among teens, and then gradually decline as women enter optimal childbearing age. In stark contrast, among African Americans, rates are actually lowest among teens and then increase with age. And this has been called a weathering phenomenon. We look at preterm birth, we see a similar pattern with respect to whites, rates being highest among teens and then slowly declining. For African Americans, a different pattern occurs. Rates do not decline with advancing age. We know that the racial disparity in preterm birth rates exists among women with 12 or more years education. The x-axis is maternal education, the y-axis is preterm birth rates. We see among African Americans and whites, it's education, or at least something closely related to it improves, preterm birth rates decline. However, the racial disparity persists among college graduated women. We know that prenatal care is exceptionally important for good outcome, but in terms of explaining the disparity, it also doesn't explain the disparity. And a group of women that I thought best highlighted this is looking at women who conceive with assisted reproductive technology. Clearly, these are women who are committed to having a successful birth outcome. They also have access to prenatal care. And we see a racial disparity with respect to term low birth weight, preterm low birth weight, and very low birth weight. Transgenerational factors are defined as those factors, conditions, environments experienced by one generation that relate to the pregnancy outcome of the next generation. For African Americans, unfortunately, the ultimate transgenerational process is slavery. And approximately 10-15% of slaves who left Africa died along the way of Middle Passage. For those who survive and the descendants, they've been in this country for approximately 400 years. And this slide kind of reviews African American citizenship and health. We see that for approximately 62% of the time in this country, African Americans were enslaved. And this created the slave health deficit. During the next subsequent 100 years, there were virtually no citizenship rights, such that the slave health deficit essentially was uncorrected. It's only been in the last 55 years that we've received most citizenship rights, but clearly there are still desperate status, outcomes, and services. Needless to say, it has been a struggle. One of the things that was driving conceptually what was happening 25, 30 years ago, is this something related to the fact that African Americans are predisposed to have preterm birth, maybe due to genetic makeup? Or is this because of the thing that I just presented? Maybe it relates to this historical context of race in this country. So we thought we should compare a group of Blacks who were born in Africa and see how they do with respect to birth outcome compared to US-born Blacks and US-born whites. And this study, which was published 25 years ago, so give or take, looked at approximately 3,000 women who themselves were born in sub-Saharan Africa who came to Illinois and gave birth. I'm an epidemiologist, so I have to present one bell-shaped curve, and this is it. Don't strain too hard, because you see that African-born Blacks have a bell-shaped curve very similar to US-born whites, and clearly distinctly different from that of infants born to US-born Blacks. This curve is shifted downward by about 280 grams. Bell-shaped curves are good for the mean. They're not good for the tail, and we know the tail is where the mortality is. So this slide looks at differing very low birth weight rates, less than 1,500 grams among low-risk women. We empirically define low risk as being college-educated, married to college-educated men, received adequate prenatal care, didn't smoke cigarettes. And we see that for US-born Blacks, they had an exceptionally high, relatively speaking, very low birth rate. But more importantly, we see infants born to African-born women, their very low birth rate was very similar to that to US-born whites. So we thought this nailed it. It kind of shows that something about being here your entire life is not good. Maybe something that's not good for your entire generational span. But one of the theories that came out, which actually made sense, is that somehow Black women migrants to the United States are intrinsically healthier and have better birth outcome than those who don't migrate. That is probably true of the healthy migrant effect. Notwithstanding the fact that 400 years ago, it was only the healthiest people who survived to begin with, but some to a degree that self-selection bias today could have driven our findings. We hypothesized, though, still that was lifelong residence in this country, or something closely related to it, was detrimental to the birth outcome of African American women. So we did a follow-up study of looking at women who themselves were born in Africa or in the Caribbean, came to Illinois, had babies. Those baby girls grew up in Illinois, 25, 30 years later, had babies. What's their birth outcome? And we found that in one generation, that birth rate distribution and that low birth rate of those daughters of foreign-born women approximated that of the general African-American population. So in one generation. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd kind of like to highlight the social determinants of that from my perspective. 4 things that we're going to look at: neighborhood poverty, racial discrimination, job strain, and partners' low socioeconomic position. Take a view at these over a life course conceptual model, hypothesizing that stress is the mechanism that kind of links these high upstream factors down to something as low stream as living a preterm infant. First, we'll look at neighborhood poverty. In Chicago, like probably most metropolitan areas, the geographic separation of the races is almost complete. We see that lifetime neighborhood experiences differ dramatically. We see that approximately 84% of whites have lifelong residence in relatively high-income neighborhoods. Only about 2% of African Americans reside in such favorable neighborhoods across their life course. In stark contrast, nearly 80% of African Americans have lifelong residence in low-income neighborhoods, compared to only about 2% of non-Latinx whites. As an epidemiologist, again, we'll show a map. This will be my one map. As you know, gun violence has been epidemic in this city for a couple of years now. And this slide kind of makes some comparisons. This figure here looks at crime-related deaths. And we see that the darker the number, the higher the rate. And we see that those rates are really concentrated in the west side and the south side. This figure over here looks at percent low birth weight. Again, the darker the number, the higher the rate. And we see that a very similar pattern of the west side and the south side having disproportionately higher rates of low birth weight, which kind of parallel that of neighborhood violence as measured by gun violence. Not surprising to anyone, living in a low-income neighborhood is not good for pregnancy outcome. The x-axis is showing African Americans and whites. The y-axis is low birth weight. We see that in both groups. Those who have a lifelong residence in low-income neighborhoods, they had a higher risk of low birth weight compared to their counterparts who lived in high-income neighborhoods. The relative risk was actually a little bit wider or greater among whites. However, the relative risk is important, but prevalence is also important. If you look at the population attributable risk, which takes into account the relative risk and the prevalence, we see that because of the high prevalence of low-income residents for African Americans, there's a big difference in the percentage of outcomes they're actually due to low income neighborhoods. We see that for whites, only about 3.5% of low birth weight infants were attributable to moms with lifelong residence in low income neighborhoods, an even lower percentage of preterm births, and a comparable percentage of growth retarded infants, of those with a birth weight for gestation age less than the 10th percentile. For African Americans, we see nearly 25% of low birth weight infants, about 12% of preterm, approximately 26% of SGA infants were actually attributable to moms with a lifelong residence in low income neighborhoods. So what is it about neighborhoods that can actually impact birth outcome? We asked the question, to what extent does neighborhood poverty modify the risk of low birth weight associated with advancing age, that webbing phenomena that we saw a few slides ago among African American women in Chicago? We empirically defined an ecological risk factor based on 4 things that we could measure: median family income of the census tract where mom lived, high unemployment rate where mom lived, high homicide rate where mom lived, and an elevated lead poisoning rate based on where she lived. Neighborhoods with 4 risk factors, we empirically defined as extremely impoverished. Neighborhoods with no risk factors were defined as non-impoverished. I think this is a great measure for poverty. It's a terrible measure for affluency. This kind of gives you the distribution for that for our study population. We see only about 21% of African American women live in neighborhoods with 0 risk factors. Nearly 35% live in neighborhoods with 1 risk factor, about 12% with 2 risk factors, 16 to 18% with 3 risk factors, and 20 to 24% live in neighborhoods with 4 risk factors. We're going to compare the 0 group to the 4 group. The 4 group was extremely impoverished. The 0 group was the non-impoverished. Maternal age is on the horizontal axis, infant low birth rates on the vertical axis, and we see a webbing phenomena even for those who resided in non-impoverished neighborhoods. For those who resided in poverty, things really start to take off for women in their late 20s. It's kind of like putting alcohol in a flame. It just made things worse. One of the things that we don't know from this study is how long did women live in these neighborhoods? Did they live there just during their pregnancy, or had they been there their entire lives? We used a different data set that looked at 2 points. We looked at mothers' median family income of their census tract when they were born. We looked at median family income of their census tract when they had their children. And we see an interesting pattern. For those who lived below the mean, so that's very conservative. Below the mean is not really a measure of poverty. You're just below the mean. Maybe we can call it low income. We call it low and lower. There we see a webbing phenomenon. Rates are lowest among teens and then increase as women enter their 30s. For those who lived in upper, which is just above the mean, and we see there's just not many women like that, relatively speaking, but for that small group, from an epidemiologic perspective, this is small, we see a pattern very similar to whites. Rates are still higher than whites, but we don't see a webbing phenomena. This provides evidence that it's really poverty that's driving this webbing phenomena among African Americans. If we look at preterm birth this time as the outcome measure, we see a similar pattern. For those in the upper, you get a hint that things are happening, coming downward, but for those who are in this lower, things are relatively flat. We asked another question subsequently: to what extent is African American women's upward economic mobility across their life course associated with birth outcome? So we know that if you live in poverty when you're born and you stay there your entire life, things aren't going to be good. But what happens if we have some upward mobility? And we found that upward economic mobility from early life residents in impoverished neighborhoods, it is indeed associated with lower risk of preterm birth among African American women in Cook County. We see on the y-axis preterm birth rates. The x-axis is maternal upward economic mobility. For those who had no upward mobility, those rates were high. For those who went a little bit up, which we just said from the first quartile to the second quartile, rates came down a little bit. Those who went from the first quartile to the third quartile, things came down a little bit more. Those had some real upward mobility from the first quartile, which is less than, I think, 22,000 a year, to the fourth quartile, which is 6 figures. You had a pretty palpable decrease in preterm birth rates. But is this because of upward mobility, or is it because of individual risk factors also improve the mobility? And maybe that's explaining our observation. And not surprisingly, the distribution of risk factors did improve. Distribution of age went, in terms of women in optimal age, went from near 80% to near 90%. Those who had some college education went from 20% to 55%. Those who were married went from 18% to 47%. Cigarette smoking also went up. Non-cigarette smoking went up. And the receipt of adequate prenatal care also went up from 47 to 59%. This slide shows the stratum Pacific odds ratio for the relationship between maternal upward mobility and preterm birth by age. Here we see the odds ratio. For those women who were less than 20, teenagers, low, modest, or high upward mobility was not associated with the decreased odds of preterm birth. You see they pretty much approximated 1, and those confidence intervals actually included 1. For those who are aged 20 to 35, though, low, modest, and high mobility were associated with a decreased odds of preterm birth. If we look among women based on education, we see that impoverished-born African-American women, upward mobility is associated with lower preterm birth rates independent of education. Those moms who didn't graduate high school were in white. For those who had some college education in red, again, upward mobility remains on the x-axis. We see that in both groups, preterm birth rates declined as upward mobility improved. So clearly education has an impact, as we know, but this shows that upward mobility, independent of education, also is contributing to improved outcome for African American women. We found the exact same pattern happen when we looked at prenatal care. For women who received inadequate in white or adequate in red, upward mobility was associated with a decreased rate of preterm birth, suggesting that, again, independent of prenatal care, upward mobility is beneficial. Interesting, we were surprised to find that upward mobility from early life impoverishment was not associated with lower preterm birth rates among former low birth weight moms. So moms who were born poor and they also had a low birth weight themselves, their preterm birth rates hovered between 20 and 22%. For those who were non-low birth weight, rates came down with upward mobility. But as this group here in white, who rates did not come down. We did some statistical logistical modeling to try to get at this a little better. And we see that for non-low birth weight moms who are aged 20 to 35, controlling for the things that we could otherwise control for on an individual level based on vital records, such as marital status, education, interpregnancy interval, smoking status, alcohol usage, parity, prior infant death, we see that low upward economic mobility, 0.8, modest upward mobility, 0.8, high upward mobility, 0.6, all significant. But for those moms who themselves were low birth weight, each of these adjusted odds ratios still approximated unity, suggesting, at least mathematically, showing that there was no association with improved upward mobility with respect to decreasing your odds of delivering a preterm infant. This time we looked at a different outcome, looking at SGA, weight for birth less than the 10th percentile. And those SGA rates are presented on the y-axis, and upward mobility, similar to what we saw for preterm birth, is associated with a decreased risk of delivering a growth retarded infant. Similar to that preterm birth, we found that when controlled for traditional risk factors, again, for moms who are themselves not low birth weight, there was a decreased odds of having a preterm infant, an SGA infant. But for moms who are themselves born low birth weight, again, we did not see any benefit. And we speculate that this reflects the impact of fetal imprinting. Fetal programming acts at the level of DNA in a phenomenon called epigenetics. Researchers have used low birth weight as the major marker of aberrant fetal programming. We suspect that aspects of mother's social environment may subject her to influences during fetal life, results in her slow growth in utero, and also programs her to have a preterm SGA infant as an adult. We need time to actually complete the study to see if that is actually true. and this needs to be replicated in other data sets. But it is interesting that historically, looking back, there have been studies using the Dutch famine, looked at women who themselves were fetuses during the Dutch famine, and then they grew up, even though once they achieved health, adult status, the Dutch famine was in the rearview mirror. They still had poor pregnancy outcome. It took another generation before those effects went away. We suspect and hope that the same thing happens with African Americans. On the other end of this, looking at neighborhood income, we asked the question, to what extent is non-Latinx white women's downward economic mobility across their life course associated with birth outcome? We see that affluent born means these are moms who were born into neighborhoods in the fourth quartile. And for those who stayed in that fourth quartile throughout their life course, therefore they had no downward economic mobility. Not surprising, their infant mortality rate is very respectable at 5.1 per thousand. But for those who experience moderate or extreme downward mobility, that infant mortality rate almost tripled. This slide looks at downward economic mobility and shows that it's associated with the increased risk of preterm birth among affluent-born white women in Cook County. We see that for those who had no downward mobility, preterm birth rates were 5.4. For those who had slight, they went from the fourth quartile down to the third quartile. Things inched up to 6.5. For those who went from the fourth quartile down to the second, a little bit higher, 8.5. For those relatively few, went from the fourth quartile down to the first quartile, something major must have happened in their lives. That preterm birth rate essentially doubled. Interesting, just for comparison, and the number is even smaller than this number, only 69 had lifelong impoverishment, but their preterm birth rate essentially approximated that of the African American population. So clearly, poverty is bad. It doesn't matter what your race ethnicity is. It just has a greater impact for African Americans because of the differences in prevalence. And we've shown that upward mobility can reverse some of that if you weren't born yourself. The next social determinant we're going to talk about, and it's kind of the elephant in the room, particularly given all that's going on in the world now and all that's going on in the past year and a half. Racism. Race is not a biological construct that reflects innate differences, but a social construct that precisely captures the impact of racism. I've always loved that word precisely. I remember when Kamara Jules wrote this 21 years ago, it really grabbed my attention. Recently, we thought it would be interesting to compare the effect of race outside of African Americans. So we obtained national vital records for the United States over a 2-year period. We looked at the effect of Black race among Latinx. And we see that for women who had not resided here their entire life, they were foreign born, came here probably during adulthood, we're not sure. Those who classify themselves as Black had a slightly higher rate than those who classify themselves as white, but we control for traditional risk factors, that disparity went away. For those who are US born, at a minimum, they were here their entire life, maybe longer, but at least for one generation they were here. We see a different pattern. For those who are Black, they had an elevated rate compared to those who were white, and this time, this gap did not go away. Again, showing that the contextual effects of race just does not apply to African Americans, it also applies to the Latinx group also. Understanding African American women's pregnancy disadvantage requires an analysis of the effect of race as a social construct. And that means addressing racism in its various forms. And there are two big forms, I think structural / personally mediated. Structural one, I think, is more insidious, more difficult to measure, but I think it's more important in terms of health. Hatred has affected America's heart, and the hate is spreading into our intellect, our economics, our politics. The result of this disease, the deaths of George Floyd and now Daunte Wright in Minneapolis, the shooting of death of an unarmed jogger in Georgia, the false accusations of a bird watcher in New York City. So we asked a question: do states with more killings of unarmed Black people have larger racial disparities in preterm birth? We obtained data from the police mapping violence database from 2013 to 2018. And we divided things up. States that had no police killings, the others who had police killings were divided into 4 quartiles. During this time period, there were approximately 310 killings, as I recall. We obtained birth record data from the CDC from 2018, and we compared racial disparities for states that had either no killings or killings that were in the first quartile compared to states that had killings that were in the second to the 4th quartile. This highlights that indeed states with more killings of unarmed Black people have larger Black-white disparities. The only state missing was Wyoming because there weren't enough preterm births in that state to count a meaningful rate. The overall disparity was 1.5, meaning that African Americans had a 50% higher chance of having a preterm infant compared to whites across all states. But the point of this slide is really to highlight that those states that had quartiles 2 to 4, this rate is statistically higher than this rate here. And we think that what this means is that discriminatory behavior of police officers reflects structural racism in state culture, which serve as an upstream cause of health inequities due to differential access to health promoting environments. This structural racism is embedded in our neighborhoods. Redlining was and is the practice of denying more and charging more for services such as insurance, banking, access to healthcare, or employment to residents in often racially determined areas. The term refers actually to the practice of putting a red line on a map to delineate where banks would invest. And this is a picture of something taken back in the day, I think 1930s or 50s. But this is just not something that happened back then, even though the legacy is still today in terms of our neighborhoods. But 5 or 6 years ago, the United States Department of Health and Urban Development announced a $200 million settlement to a bank over redlining in Chicago and Milwaukee. And they found that mortgage loans were denied to African American and Hispanic applicants between 2008 and 2010. Mendez et al. Obtained data from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act to create redlining indices for census tracts in Philadelphia. They found that African Americans were twice as likely to be denied a loan compared to white applicants, independent of annual income, loan amount, gender, and they were more likely to live in redline areas. We read this and took it a step further and thought that redlining could be used as a measure of institutional racism that correlates with other indices of segregation. More importantly, maternal residence in redline areas is associated with higher rates of preterm birth, independent of loan amounts, neighborhood income, gender, age, education, and marital status. And we found that both of those hypotheses were indeed true. This slide kind of summarizes the distribution. We see that for people who lived in neighborhoods with a low proportion of African Americans, there is a low incidence of redlining. Redlining is defined as an index less than 1.4, only 7.5%. But nearly 51% moderate redlining, 27% high redlining, 14% very high. For those neighborhoods that had a high proportion of African Americans, the percentage of low redlining is increased significantly from 7.5% to 54%. The converse is the rate of African American to white denial decreased in the moderate from 51 to 43, the high from 27 to 6, and there is nothing in the very high, essentially 14 to 0. This slide shows that mortgage discrimination and preterm birth are associated with one another in Chicago. The x-axis is redlining index, less than 1.5 is redlining. This is preterm birth rates. And you kind of get a flavor of the general trend, notwithstanding this, that as redlining increased, the risk of preterm birth also rose. Personally mediated racism is a little bit easier to measure and form some stronger associations that maybe can better link with causality. Structural racism is very upstream. It requires a a different thought process, but I think it is more important than what we're going to talk about for the next 2 minutes, which is just interpersonal racial discrimination. We actually tried to measure it by administering a questionnaire to two groups of women who delivered preterm very low birth weight infants, and the same questionnaire to women who delivered term non-low birth weight infants. And this relatively small group of women, we found that women who delivered a preterm very low birth weight infant were more likely to experience racial discrimination, finding work, at work, for those who are in school, in the public arena, receiving medical care. Since the study was published, 2004, there's probably been 24 studies which have confirmed and expanded these findings. But the most important one, in my opinion, is really one by Paula Brevman and the group in California. Instead of looking retrospectively, they looked prospectively, and they gave surveys to approximately 2,000 African-American women, over 8,000 non-Latinx white women who delivered singleton births over a 3-year period in California. And they found 37% of African Americans, compared to 6% of white women, reported chronic worry about racial discrimination. Most importantly for us, we see that chronic worry about racial discrimination was associated with a twofold risk of preterm birth among African American women. Because these investigators administered the questionnaire to white women, they actually could examine the impact this had on the racial disparity. And they found that the racial disparity in preterm birth was attenuated and actually became non-significant when adjusted for chronic worry. Job strain. There were a couple studies that I thought that are good to kind of emphasize the importance of where you work and how that impacts your outcome. One is from Quebec. It looked at women who were employed in positions characterized by high levels of job strain, which is high demand and low control. To me, that kind of equates maybe to McDonald's. And they found that these women had about twice the risk of preterm birth. A similar study using Connecticut data that appended job characteristics data found that preterm birth was specifically associated with jobs that allowed for little control for the employee. We went back and looked at our group of women who we sampled in our study to ask them their experiences in the workplace. And we found that 2/3 of the women in our study actually worked during pregnancy. They worked mostly as clerks, cashiers, and educators. And these women were given 10 additional questions about racism. After the data was collected, responses were dichotomized into none, which is either none or few times or once a year, or chronic, which was few times a year, few times a month, at least once a week, or nearly every day. Give you an idea, here are 3 other questions. You will watch more closely than others because of your race. Whites often assume that you work in a lower class job than you do and treat you as such. You're treated with less dignity and respect than you would be if you were white. And we see that maternal chronic exposure to interpersonal racial discrimination in the workplace was associated with preterm birth. We see that moms who delivered a preterm very low birth weight infant were more likely to experience 1 or more, 3 or more racist events on a chronic basis compared to African American women who delivered term non-low birth weight infants. The same trend occurred for 7 or more, but we lost statistical significance. Fathers. This is the last social determinant I want to talk about, but it doesn't mean it's not the most important. Maternal child has routinely investigated the social determinants of birth outcome as measured by women's characteristics. But the social, economic, and cultural landscape of African American fatherhood suggests that the role of dad's socioeconomic position may be particularly salient to the racial disparity in birth outcome. We know that college graduation rates are very low for African Americans and far less than that of African American women. African American men are far less than African American women. We know unemployment rates are sky high for African American men. And equally disturbing, we know incarceration rates are sky high. So the other slides that I've presented so far I think are pretty easy to follow. And I know it's getting relatively late in the day, so this one I want you to pay a little bit better attention to, and I hope I can do service by explaining it. We obtained national vital records again over a 2-year period, looking at the outcome for African Americans compared to US-born Blacks versus foreign-born Blacks, US-born Black women versus US-born white women. We first just look at this bar graph here. The x-axis, looks at US-born Black versus foreign-born Black disparity. So the disparity itself was 3.3. The absolute disparity rate is on the y-axis. This gray part is the part that's unexplained. And that's because, in my opinion, on vital records, we don't have information about neighborhood income. We don't have information about racism. So what's really important is missing. But we use this special type of statistical analysis, which I'm just learning, called Wahika analysis. Wahika analysis is something that's been used initially in economics to try to get at what part of disparity is due to a particular variable. This light blue, ignore the number, but it is 2.8, is other variables. Other variables on the birth certificate included prenatal care, interpregnancy interval, and they explain a significant portion of the disparity because we can actually see it. This red, ignore the number, but it's palpable, we can see it, and this red represents virtual education. So it explained a palpable part of the disparity. This dark blue is paternal involvement is loosely or crudely defined as dad being acknowledged on the birth certificate. If dad is acknowledged, if dad's not acknowledged, it's a risk factor. And we see that it's explaining a greater proportion of this disparity than even maternal education. If we look at US-born Blacks versus US-born whites, we see a very similar trend. But most importantly, we see that maternal education is palpable. We know that it's really important, but paternal involvement, again, weakly defined by acknowledgement, seems to be explaining maybe a little more, but it's palpable, it's there. Just naming on birth certificate. So this looks at the excess preterm birth rate among US-born compared to foreign-born Black women, looking at the role of father's education. X-axis now is paternal education. For US-born Blacks and foreign-born Blacks, we see that in both groups, dad's education is having an impact. Now it's saying that the disparity with respect to nativity persists, but definitely dad's education is having an impact. Using Wahika analysis again, this time looking at just acknowledged dads who have education listed on the birth certificate, we see that dad's education was actually explaining a greater percentage of the disparity than mom's education. So dad's education may be a modifiable risk factor that we can go after to try to address the racial disparity in preterm birth. Going back to our transgenerational data set, we have data from when dad was born and when his sons and daughters were born. We see that dads had a lifelong low. Their paternal socioeconomic status, their first year mortality rate was sky high. But for dads who had a parenthood low, things came down a bit more. Dads who were just low income during childhood, things came down even a little bit more. For those who had a lifelong residence in high income neighborhoods, rates were low again. But again, how much of this is mom versus how much of this is dad. This slide here looks at African Americans' lifelong socioeconomic position and shows it's associated with low birth rate rates independent of maternal education. We see that in each maternal education group, dads with a lifelong low had a higher rate of low birth weight compared to dads with a lifelong high. Less than 12, 12, and for those who had some college education. Look for marital status, we see the same trend, but most importantly, for married dads, we see that those with lifelong low had a higher rate than those with lifelong high. But interesting, this group here, this rate is very low, married and lifelong high. So more work needs to be done, but it gives us the indication that dad's status is important, independent of mom's status. Looking at preterm birth, less than 37 weeks, we see that globally speaking, that those with lifelong low had a preterm birth rate of 13% compared to 6% for lifelong high. But if we divide preterm birth into the late component, which is 34 to 36 weeks, and the early component, we see that the earlier component, the disparity is even wider, 3.9 to 1.4. So I've given a lot of information in the past 45 or 50 minutes about neighborhood poverty, racial discrimination, job strain, and partners' low socioeconomic position. And I suspected, as I said then, that stress is kind of what links this to poor outcome. And we have some data that suggests that that is indeed the case. If we look at the placenta, and this slide kind of reviews the placenta findings for women who delivered a preterm infant. And we find that African American women who delivered a preterm infant, their placentas were more likely to show evidence of chronic inflammation compared to white women who delivered preterm infants. So we speculate that this chronic inflammation is the result of those upstream things that we've been talking about for the past 45 or 50 minutes. Clearly, more work needs to be done making these connections. But from a public health perspective, what challenges do we face in eliminating disparities? Challenge number one, historical insults contribute to current disparities. I hate to say it, but I think until the effects of past historical ills are undone, disparities will not be eliminated. Challenge number two, social factors are the largest contributor to disparities, but often ignored. Medical, molecular, and biological factors get the most focus and funding. Challenge number three, we do not consistently distinguish between health care disparity and health disparity. Differences in medical care is only one of many contributors to the overall health disparities. So if we're committed to having an input, I'm a big believer in going big. Go ecological, begin to address the social and economic inequalities that are the root cause of health disparities. And that means that I think we have to put structural racism on the agenda. We have to name it as a force determining the distribution of other social determinants. We have to routinely monitor for differential exposures, opportunities, and outcomes by race. I'll leave you with one of my favorite poems written by Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Oh, let America be America again. The land that has never been yet, and yet must be. The land where every woman is free. And then I'm going to leave you with this group of Black Tulane University medical students posed at a plantation and show their past, how their past inspired their future. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish I was there in person. Virtual doesn't do justice, but I'd love to try to answer any questions or concerns that you might have in the chat. Thank you.
Dr. Collins, thank you so much for incredibly informative and moving talk about these horrific disparities that we face. So we do have a few minutes that we can do questions. If folks can either be done in the chat, or we've had reasonable success if people want to be able to try asking them in person. Maybe if we switch to the sort of a gallery mode, we might be able to see folks. Anybody have a question? Dr. Padbury, why don't you jump in and be our first question?
Jim, what's up, man? It's been a minute.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good if you are.
Yeah, good.
So, I'm not going to say I enjoyed your talk because it was just too, hard to hear, but
yeah, but
it is what it is.
Yeah.
So let me ask like you say to teenagers, let's talk about solutions, not problems. So I'm wondering about universal basic income and whether or not you have enough data to actually go back and kind of dose response like you and I did when we did the catecholamines and the insulin study. You should tell the audience we are published together.
Exactly.
So, I'm thinking about whether or not we hold the Senate and the House and the kind of data that would win the argument if there's a dose response on universal basic income, which actually is better than traditional modes of social supports, whether you could find that, say what the threshold is. Is
Yeah.
this a good question?
I think it's a great question. And I think if we look big, if we just look at how, that first slide, which looks at our dismal international ranking, if we were to look at spending for, families, we would also be at the bottom. I think it's clear that neonatology is a lot of things. Inexpensive is not one of them. And that's just one consequence of prematurity. We could look at a lot of others. But if we could somehow show that not only can we improve health outcomes, but we can improve a lot of outcomes in the long run if we spend more money up front. And I don't know if that's a hook to try to get people to pay more attention than what is currently being done.
To win the argument in the place I don't want to name, near 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes.
We need data.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Can you use your data? Is there a dose response to it? I'm just trying to think of ways to. It's like grantsmanship.
Right. That's an interesting tactic. I have to go back and look at that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great to see you.
Yeah, great seeing you. Appreciate it. Yes. Yep. I like that approach.
So we do have something in the chat from Dr. Pablo Rodriguez. Could you speak a bit about how first-generation immigrant Black Africans have different outcomes than African Americans, and what can be learned from their experience?
I think two things. I think one, when they come, they just don't come as a group of one, they come as a group. And I think there's a built-in support network that helps buffer some of the realities. The other is they don't have necessarily the perceptions of the subtleties of implicit bias that African Americans who've been in for a while are aware of. Clearly that doesn't last very long. But I think the support of the whole group phenomena is very important and helps build resiliency in terms of outcomes and health.
Another question, a student from here at Brown, Sarah Grill, have there been any successful interventions to reduce redlining today?
To reduce redlining, good question. I think there have been incentives now to decrease the loan threshold for African Americans. One of the interesting things, students ask the best questions. There's a city where I live, Evanston, Illinois, which prides itself on being Northwestern. It has prided itself of being integrated, but historically the legacy of redlining exists. So you see predominantly African American communities, predominantly white communities, even in a place like Evanston. But literally about a month ago, they have approved reparations for people who experienced redlining in the 60s to get money to use that as a down payment for a house. I thought it was unbelievable. My daughter, a sophomore at Tufts, said, "Yeah, Dad, it ain't enough." But I feel like an old person. I go, I've been living my entire life. I've never seen anything like this before. At least it's a step in the right direction. But if you can actually identify, use that as a tool, and hopefully Evanston can be a model for moving forward. I'm not aware of any other municipality that has made such a move. But that will help in the consequences of redlining.
So I'm being mindful of time. We may have time for one more question if someone wants to sneak one in. But I want to take the chance to thank you, Dr. Collins, both for serving on the Hassenfeld Child Health Innovation Advisory Council and your input there, And today, for a talk that not only affected the brain and thinking this through, but also the heart of, as we've seen lots of comments in the chat about the impact of this. And I want to make sure at least I get a chance to ask a question. If you could do one thing, I always circle back to Dr. Padbury, who was pushing the of 1600 Pennsylvania. But I want something more specific, in some ways let you be more specific. If you could do one thing, what would you do?
Yeah, I would. One thing, I would invest in neighborhoods. I would improve the living standard of minimal standard of every neighborhood. There's certain basic things that have to be met with respect to where we live, how we live in those neighborhoods. I just think that is just so important. So I would give money for development of neighborhoods.
I think that's a great way to end this, as we began, of the importance of zip code over genetic code, as you titled your talk. And again, as I will quote the last thing I see in the chat of thank you for a powerful and inspiring talk. I think that is universal from people here. So thank you very much, Dr. Collins.
You're very welcome. Take care.
Thank you all for joining us.
And stay positive.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Take care.